And we passed that last week. We had about 10 votes to spare. And I'm pretty sure the Senate's going to get their version out, and then we're going to have to reconcile the two and vote on them again. So we have quite a bit more work to do. But I campaigned on this last year. We want to get our corporate rates down to 20%. When you think communist China has corporate rates of 25%, we're at 35%, right? We got to do better. Canada's at 15%. Ireland's at 12, going to 8%. England's at 17%. The average in Europe is 22%. And so we have to be more competitive. We got to get those rates down to 20. Now the other folks on the other side of the aisle will say a lot of people get deductions and those rates get lowered. But the folks I talked to in Nebraska, I would say 9 out of 10 companies that are corporations are paying at 35%. I've heard one at 33%. So we got to do more to help our companies compete. I like to run. And I feel like what we're doing to our companies is putting 50 pounds around their back and putting them uphill and say compete with everybody else. And we want our companies to win and to grow. We're also going to make some changes to the S corporations. So we're going to do a 25% tax rate and it's a 30-70% ratio there. I think we could have done better, but still a step in the right direction. And the first $75,000 will be taxed at a 9% rate. And that takes us, I think we could have done more with the S corporations. I hope we can get more through the Senate and the reconciliation, but it is a step in the right direction. On the individual side, we wanted to get simplicity. So we went from 7 rates to 4. Frankly, the House wanted 3, but the President asked us to put the 39.6% rate back in, so we ended up doing it. But really we're trying to get simplicity. 90% of the people, or filers, will be able to file just using the standard deduction, almost as simple on a postcard. And that's what we're looking to do. 10% will have to do the itemized deductions out there. But we've gone to a double standard deduction of $24,000 for a married couple, for individual $12,000. Most folks, 90% will fall within that. And so that's a step in the right direction. An average family of 4, middle income family, won't have to pay income taxes on the first $50,000 of their income with this tax reform. We maintain the charitable deduction, the IRA deduction, the 529 or the college, putting in for your college funds. One of the more controversial aspects of this was the SALT taxes or the state, whether it's real estate taxes or the income taxes. So we compromised in the House. We went to a $10,000 real estate tax deduction, which covers 90% of the folks. And it covers, we're a little bit of a higher tax state, but it still covers most of our folks. Or the first $500,000 loan on the interest. So that's sort of the plan by and large. And I like what we're hearing. The average family of 4 that earns $59,000 will be getting about a $1,200 taxes back, or reduction. And we'll see roughly a $3,000 increase in income over the next few years. And we're seeing new estimates out yesterday. We're looking at 4% GDP growth with this bill. But we got more work to do. We got to get the bill out of the Senate, and then we got to reconcile it. And but I think this will be one of the most important things we can do in this House. So the next thing that I worked on last week too, we voted on the Defense Authorization Act. So let me back up a little bit. If you go back 8 years ago, and you look at the budget that we had for defense, and you look where we're at today, we cut defense by 18% in the budget. It was 22%, but we put 4% back in last year. So right now we're at minus 18%. And we did 31 continuing resolutions, meaning the House and the Senate, we couldn't agree, or with the President Obama at the time. So we just said we're going to extend last year's spending. When you do that, you can't give pay raises, you can't do any increases in production for, like, say, F-35s. You can't improve training. It's like an autopilot. So when you combine those 31 CRs and the sequester cuts, which reduced us 18% total, our military was and is struggling. So today, only half the Navy aircraft can fly on any given day. The world's best Navy. So think about that. Half of the Navy aircraft can't fly. Something's wrong. 58 combat brigades in the Army. Only 3 can fight tonight, we call it, out of 58. That's not good for deterrence. And if you look at the Air Force, folks used to fly like what I do as a captain versus the captains today. They're only getting 1/3 of the flying training today that I got back in the 90s. So imagine only getting 1/3 of the training. And this summer, we lost 42 servicemen and women in training accidents, not operational in Iraq or Afghanistan. And if you talk to the 4-stars, they'll say, well, the guys on the ship didn't really understand their navigation equipment when we had those collisions. And that goes to training. So we're stretching our people thin, we're working them hard, but they're not getting the training that we used to give them to be good at it. So we gotta fix it. And there's a bunch of us in the House that are gonna say no more to CRs. The line's in the sand. If we gotta have a knockout, drag out in December, we're gonna have one, because we gotta get this fixed. We gotta get it right. So this new bill that we passed this past week, reconciled with the Senate, it still has to be appropriated though, will increase defense by 10%. So that will take us to about a -8 when it's all said and done. So a 10% increase. What that's gonna do is give about $70 billion more for the military, which will allow us to put $8 billion into cyber, in a plus up. We're gonna put $2 billion more in missile defense. We're gonna expand the F-35 production. We're gonna start getting the Navy back to where it can put out a 355 ship Navy. So we'll expand that. We're gonna increase manpower by 19,000. And we're gonna give the first pay raise, full pay raise, to the military in 8 years, this coming year with this bill. So I think we're moving the right direction. We're gonna get the readiness and maintenance fixed and get it where we're taking care of our men and women in uniform. I believe in peace through strength, and we know we got some threats out there. We got Korea with at least 10 nuclear weapons. We've seen what Russia's doing in the Ukraine and the Baltics, and we need a strong deterrent force. That's what we're providing. We're also going to start working on the Farm Bill. We're doing all the committee hearings, we're crafting it right now, and the hope is the first quarter of 18 that we'll release the Farm Bill, start doing our markups. But here's the things that I'm looking to do. The number one thing I hear from farmers today and ranchers, and primarily farmers in this case, is affordable crop insurance. And we're gonna take a little reduction in the crop insurance, but it won't be what was initially forecast. There was a forecast of 20%. We're looking at more about 5%. But we're gonna make sure we have that, because I hear it loud and clear from the farmers that we need it. We wanna make sure we start working on foot and mouth disease prevention. When you look at what would happen if we had an outbreak with our cattle and livestock, or the pork farmers, hog farmers, we would lose our trade for over 5 years. So we need to have a prevention system there that will help take care of that. We want to make sure that we expand trade. So this is one of the hot issues we have with the administration right now. We've got to be opening doors, not shutting doors for agriculture. And so when you look at what we're being charged in Japan, at almost about a 49% tariff on our beef, but yet Australia is being charged about half that, and that makes it hard for us to compete. So we got to get in there and contend for some fair trade agreements with folks overseas. So that's another thing we got to work on. We can do some of that in the Farm Bill itself. We also need to be expanding some research opportunities with the University of Nebraska, which does a lot of agriculture research, and we benefit from that. So I'll be looking for that in the Farm Bill and trying to make sure we have some good inserts there. And finally, if you look at, there's 5 countries in Africa, they're starving. They have zero production capability in their own ag. I'd like to use a lot of our surplus for aid and funnel that towards these 5 countries. It's not as if we're taking away from their farmers. They're not producing anything right now in these 5 countries. So there's a section in the Farm Bill that we can work on that. And I think we are a bountiful country, and we have a supply and demand issue right now. We can get some of that grain and some of our food products out there. So those are the highlights that we have right now, or we're getting ready to do. What we're going to be doing next quarter, we're going to be working on immigration. So we're going to see a combination of a border security bill. You're going to be looking at an immigration bill, and then we've got to figure out how to compassionately handle our DACA youth. And we're going to have to do all 3 of those at once, or pretty much simultaneously. So you're going to hear a lot about that probably in January time frame. You're going to start hearing about welfare reform. The number one issue I hear when I go out to the larger employers in Omaha, I hear about taxes, I hear about health care, but more so, I hear that they're having a hard time filling the jobs in their companies. I hear frequently, we have folks come in, they want to work for 20 hours only and nothing more because of loss of Medicaid or whatever services they may be getting. It sends them over a tripwire. So we got to be thinking about how do we reform our welfare so that we can incentivize people back to full-time labor. And that was not on our agenda last January and February, but when I went back home, I heard it over and over, and so did Speaker Ryan, so did Kevin McCarthy. So folks all over the country are sharing this with their representatives, so we've made it now a top issue to work on. We're going to see an infrastructure bill. I'm not sure how that's going to look quite yet, but I know it's President Trump's #2 priority after tax reform. So that's going to come up there. So I know we'll have something. I'm just not sure how we're going to pay for it yet, but that will be another thing that we work on with a lot of emphasis for this coming year. So let me just review the bidding again on the committees are working on what we're focusing on. So in the Armed Services Committee, it was the NDAA or the authorization bill. So I already told you about that. On agriculture, we're working on the farm bill. It's imperative that we get this done. As you all know, food prices are at 50% of what they were 4 years ago. And taking a 50% pay cut for 4 years is awful hard. And we see it in our state budget. We're ahead with $1 billion shortfall. So we got to get this farm bill right, and we got to work on trade. Those are the two critical issues on the agriculture side. I'm also on the Small Business Committee, as I mentioned, and it's interesting for me to see all the data from our small businesses, which are represented in here. Up until last year, the #1 issue that we heard from small businesses was regulations. The #2 issue was tax reform, with the S-Corp primarily, the pass-through money. This year, for the first time, it was healthcare. Healthcare has trumped every other issue because of the costs that small businesses are paying. The mom and pop that has a store, and they're around 40 years old or so, they're paying roughly $30,000 a year for health insurance. That individual market is broke. So as you know, the House worked on this. This was our #1 priority back in February and March, April, and it was tough. I mean, we had, if you know the dynamics are in the conference, you have 32 Freedom Caucus people, you have roughly 50 Tuesday group people. They're more on the liberal side of the party. You have the 32 that are in the Freedom Caucus on the conservative end. Then you have everybody else in the middle. But we had a hard time getting the two ends to agree to a bill, so it took a lot of work to get done. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it through the Senate. But I'm here to tell you that we can't just walk away from it because we failed in the Senate. With people paying $30,000 a year, some people paying $40,000 a year, when you figure in the deductibles, we have to get that done. So I believe that we need to break this down to smaller pieces. Because if we're trying to do the big individual market, and we're trying to also do the Medicaid fix, we're not going to get this done. So I think we should focus right now on the individual market, which is about 7% of our people. But they're the ones that are paying about the $30,000 a year. And we got to figure out how to bring down those costs. And there's a lot of good proposals out there, from changing the pool structure to tort reform, you name it. And we got to get that done. So we got to make that part of our agenda as well. And I want you to know, on the regulation front for small businesses, the House has passed 16 targeted bills going after specific regulations, and the Senate's passed all but one, and they were all signed by the President, the ones that the Senate got through. So we've done a lot to roll back the major regulations that the previous administration put on us. We've also passed two big bills. One bill was called the REINS Act. We said if any agency puts out a new regulation that has a $100 million impact, it has to get approval from Congress. But that's sitting in the Senate right now. And we also passed the Regulatory and Accountability Act, which said that if you pass a new regulation, you have to have a section in that regulation that talks about the impact to that group that you're regulating, whether it's small businesses, whether it's farmers. So I was on the floor debating this bill, saying how important it is to roll back these regulations. And folks on the other side of the aisle, one of them got up and it was their turn to speak and do these 2-minute back and forths. And this one gentleman on the other side of the aisle goes, "We object to this bill because it makes it too hard on the bureaucrats." And we go, yes, it does. And that's why we like it. We agree. But that was an interesting comment. They were more worried about the impact on bureaucrats and not the small businessman or woman or the farmer. But I want to close on one note. We'll take some questions. I want you to know that the House has passed more bills, and I would say they're conservative bills, the conservative agenda, than any Congress going back 3 decades. But you probably don't know that. Because unfortunately, a lot of them are stacking up in the Senate. And I love our two senators. They're voting on these bills just the way I would. But the Senate as a whole cannot get this moved. We have the filibuster problem, which is an issue. You have to have 60 votes. And we're just a 52-48 majority. We're moving slow as molasses. So I just want you to know the House has been moving. We have moved everything we have set out to vote on. Maybe not at the right timing. Maybe it took us an extra month for health care, but we are getting the job done. But we got to get more stuff out of the Senate. And it's got to start. We got to get this tax reform done. So with that, I will just say it's a privilege to be part of the congressional delegation. We have a great group of 5 of us. We get along really well, and I really appreciate you having me back here at Lincoln. And I'd love to take a question or two if I may.
And I'll go out with a microphone. If anybody has a question, you want to raise your hand.
I can give you some bacon jokes too.
I will ask you, when it comes to the atmosphere of Republicans and Democrats working together, it just seems from the outside looking in, it's very toxic. Is it toxic?
It's not toxic when you're in a small group and you're looking at people one-on-one. When it gets toxic is when they get behind the microphone, and then it gets rough. So there's this one freshman, I will not mention his name. So I got to know him, I had to go through orientation with him. One of the most mild-mannered, easy-going people I'd met, affable. We led tours to various museums, freshman tours, like to the Holocaust Museum. And one day I was the presiding officer in the House, and he got up to speak, and I go, do I know this guy? It was like a Shakespearean speech, just ripping the shreds out of the president. And I was like, I didn't even think it was the same guy, but yeah, you get people behind a microphone, and it gets a little rough. Unfortunately, like on the tax reform bill, it's like a scorched earth mentality right now. So Nancy Pelosi said, if we can defeat tax reform, we will take back the House. So sometimes it's not about the bill itself. It is about who's going to have the majority next cycle. I think that's unfortunate. I wish we were better than that. Yes, sir.
Well, first I'd like to say thank you for your service and your continued advocacy for military families.
Well, thank you.
You mentioned a 10% increase to defense spending, which is only bridging part of the gap.
Right.
Is there a continued vision to improve on that?
So we want to do a 10% increase, which, as I mentioned already, takes us to -8%, going back a decade roughly. And our goal is to keep that with inflation thereafter. And we think that that's enough to get us back healthy. But you can't do that in just 1 year. We have to sustain that 10% plus inflation for about 3 years, 4 years, until we get really healthy again in our military. And I appreciate you mentioned about looking out for military families. I got my first bill passed. It's called the Gold Star. It's a commitment to Gold Star families for life. And I'm going to have a series of bills that really look out for our Gold Star spouses. So, I had to do a lot of knocking on people's doors as a general in the military. I had to talk to 10 different families about the loss of a loved one. So I got to know Gold Star families in a personal way that way. And then once I got elected, I've met these Gold Star spouses, and they feel disenfranchised. They lose access to the base. A lot of them do after 2 or 3 years. And so imagine that you're married to, whether you're a husband or wife, and you lose that spouse in Iraq or Afghanistan, and that was your connection too. I mean, that was your life as well, the military life. And 3 years later, you can't get on the base. Some of these folks have their spouse buried on base, and they have to get a pass to get on. And some of them had these children from that spouse, and they can't go to the BX or commissary or get them to the doctor, right? So I had heard enough of this to know, okay, we can do some things to fix that. So we did a Gold Star bill that will give our Gold Star spouses lifetime access to the base. They'll get a Gold Star card, and it'll be a new tradition. And we're going to expand the BX and commissary privileges for them if they have dependents. And that's just a first step. I took a baby step because you want to get something done. And I've learned if you try to get too much in a bill, it just sits there. So my next step is these same spouses get about $1,000 a month. And they get some education benefits. But if they remarry, they lose it. So a lot of these spouses put off getting married and with life because they're afraid of what the impact it's going to have on their kids. And I think we can do better. We're talking about roughly 2,500 Gold Star spouses from Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not this huge number. So I think we can maintain that stipend so they can go on with their life and and not stop their life. So that's going to be round 2. Yes?
Thank you for your service, and thank you for your vote on
Thank you.
a reasonable tax reform bill. My question is there any compromise that could have been made by the majority party to get 10 to 20% of the minority to support it on tax reform?
Right. You know, I think we were definitely saddled with probably 2 things. First of all, as I already mentioned, Nancy Pelosi said if we defeat tax reform, we'll take back the House. So I think that was one they probably whipped pretty hard to have a monolithic group. I also think when you do reconciliation bills, which is what we did, where it requires only 51 votes in the Senate, you only can do one of those a year, one reconciliation bill a year. But just by definition of doing it, it becomes more partisan because it is intended to get that 50 vote thing. So I think that right away it's hard to do that. I'd like to think we could have done more, but I don't see areas of compromise on this. Like in healthcare, most of the folks on the other side of the aisle, and I'm friends with many of them, but there's a big desire to do more healthcare, more single payer. And that's the antithesis of what we're trying to do, right? And I think on the tax reform, the corporate tax rates were not a starter. It was perceived as helping out only the wealthy. But yet we want to get our businesses on a level playing field. So I wish we could have done better on that. But I'll tell you an area that we can do better for compromise and getting more Republican and Democrats together is immigration. Because on one end, there's a lot of desire for some expanded compassion for those who are here. And on the other end, we want to improve our border and improve our visa system, employer enforcement. And I think if we put those 2 together, we have the opportunity to get a good compromise bill. So I think that's an area that I see a lucrative ability to cross the aisle and make an impact. Yes, sir.
Congressman, I work in the oil and gas industry, and President Trump's really been a godsend to our industry.
For regulations particularly, yes.
Yeah. Rolling back regulation, suspending some BLM rulings and things like that. So what is going on, if anything, legislatively to help the oil and gas industry, coal industry, the fossil fuel industry in general?
Well, on the regulatory front, I did mention that the president's done a good job rolling back regulations, and we've done those 16 targeted, and some of them dealt with coal, some of it's dealt with oil and gas, taking off regulations from the previous administration. The problem is, when the president does it by itself, the next administration can put them back on. So we need to have some legislative limits to what agencies can do. That's why I'm a supporter of that REINS Act that says if you have a new regulation that has a $100 million impact, you've got to have congressional approval. Because what we don't want to do is every president comes in and they change, through executive order, just change everything that the previous administration did. So I think legislatively we can fix that with the REINS Act, as I mentioned, and the Regulatory and Accountability Act. I'm a big believer of all the above type energy. So I was thrilled about the vote yesterday for the pipeline. I think we want to become energy independent in our country, and that's a big part of it. So I can't really speak specifically on any other, because I'm not in the Energy or Commerce Committee, but I'm going to bring out that chairman out here, so I'll make sure you get an invite when he comes out. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but I'm more attuned to the regulation side, and we have made some efforts to lift those regulations off the oil and gas and the coal. Yes, sir.
Congressman,
That's good to see you again.
Thank you so much for your service, and really appreciate the values you stand for and what you're trying to do to improve our ag economy and the small business economy. Specific question in the healthcare space, as you alluded, you know, it's kind of a mess. It's even worse of a mess given we weren't able to pass legislation. If you're removing, from what the House looks like, they're removing the medical deduction, you've got that couple that you talked about is spending $30,000. If they're actually working for a small organization that doesn't have health care benefits, they're not going to have the ability to deduct those premiums. So you've also got the situation, long-term care costs are also out of space, so then where are they going to get deductions for that? So I'm wondering, have they considered significantly raising the HSA cap, where it's around $7,500, or maybe put that in that $30,000 category, so the average household has a place that they can get a break and haven, and then also expand it to where those that are 65 could still contribute to an HSA.
Unfortunately, there was some discussions early on to reduce a lot of these accounts, because we had a $1.5 trillion bogey for the tax cuts, right, or tax reform. And we were at that 1.5 trillion, so there was a lot of proposals, well, if we reduce this, for example, HSA or IRA caps, that gives us a higher ceiling over here. Thankfully, we were able to push that off. But I think we should look at the expansion of that. I would tell you on the medical deduction, it was one of the 4 or 5 key ones that were debated over and over again. Should we add that back in? But when you look at the numbers, very few people would have benefited by it when you also figure in the double standard deduction and some of the other things you put in the lower rates. In every deduction we put back in, you were going to have to increase the rate or remove another deduction somewhere because we were at the cap. So in the end, we ended up trying to do what would benefit the most people across the board. And I don't know that we got it quite right, and I think this will be a work in progress. Depending on what the Senate puts out, we'll have a compromise, so this will get changed again. I would even say once we pass it, next year and the following year, we have opportunities to keep tweaking these deductions to get it right. But I would say the medical deduction was probably one of the most debated parts of the bill on the House side. We probably went through that for about 2 or 3 weeks, along with worried about the home builders and the real estate aspects of that as well. We talk a lot about historic buildings and the tax deductions for that, so that was pushed quite a bit as well. So there was 3 or 4 areas that were a lot of contention, and I don't think we're done yet. Yes, sir.
If you do get the Tax Reform Act through, will that be effective for 2017 or 2018 or when?
For the House bill, it'll be on 1 January 18. Now, the Senate had proposed delaying a year because that bottomed some room under that cap. But the House is pretty adamant, no. we want this to be effective 1 January because we want people to start getting those benefits next January and not waiting a year. But the Senate did have a proposal, I don't know where they're at right now. I've lost track because it keeps changing every day, to wait 1 year because that bottomed another so many more billions of dollars that they could put in for other deductions. And so it's our opinion that we want to start this year, but we still have to get it through the reconciliation process and get it out of the Senate.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming and
Thank you.
thanking the Congressman.